was big, but God told them he was going to give them victory anyway. And so this brings us to number one. This is one. God, the promise. The promise is God promises to give them victory. God promised to give them victory. And so my number one is God has promised you victory. I want you to say that. Say, God has promised me victory. The reason why this would be difficult for them to get, because many times when we think about success, or especially in armies, we think of size. So many people associate success with size. So when God says to Israel, who is small, that he's going to use them to destroy a big giant city like Jericho, it looks like it's kind of hard to envision. And this is what I believe made Joshua a great leader, because his perception of God's strength was not limited to his size, but he was able to look at himself and say, I believe that God's strength is not limited to how big or how small I am. And I think that's significant, because sometimes we deal with issues, sometimes we deal with problems, sometimes we deal with challenges that seem too big for us. And I like the fact that Joshua, even when they first went to go spy out the land, his attitude was such an attitude that God's strength is not limited to all of my weaknesses, but he recognized that God can use a vessel like him. And here's what I want to point out about that tonight, because what we see in the Bible a lot of times about God is that God always uses the underdog. And I like that he always uses the underdog. He uses sometimes the smaller things, right, to overthrow the bigger things. And sometimes you read a story in the Bible and then you like, how in the world did they get victory? And it's just designed to get you to understand that sometimes things will look bigger than you, but as long as you have God on your side, you ought not let that detour you. And so I always say it like this, like perception is everything. And sometimes you can look at a situation or look at a challenge and it'll seem too big. And this is what the nation of Israel said. The nation of Israel said, we look like grasshoppers in our own sight. And sometimes the problem can look so big that it makes you feel small. But I like this text because it shows that it doesn't matter how big the obstacle looks. If God is with you, God can still make you win. And so that's number one. Say, God has promised me victory. God is going to help me win. And so I want you to encourage yourself with that. Every time you get discouraged, remind yourself that God is going to help you win. Every time it looks like you're about to lose, remind yourself that God is going to help me win. God is going to help me overcome. Every time you get overwhelmed, remind yourself that if God is for me, it doesn't matter how big the challenge is against me. It doesn't matter how big the obstacle looks in front of me. It doesn't matter how big the mountain is. If God is for me, and I want you to encourage yourself. That's number one, the promise. The promise is that God is going to give them the victory, no matter what it looks like, no matter what it seems like. God is going to give them the victory. And I want that to speak to you tonight.